Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the election analysis with Dr. Stern. It should be a really great program today. Dr. Stern has his PhD from the University of Rochester. He was a professor and vice president of academic affairs at Shepherd University. He is professor emeritus from Arizona State University, and he is the author of Calculating Visions, Kennedy, Johnson, and Civil Rights. This is part of a two-part program. So today he's going to be talking about the upcoming November election. And on November 15th, he'll be back and he's going to break down the results of the election. So it should be a great two-part program. So Dr. Stern, why don't you go ahead and lead us off?
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I have no one up on the screen but Dan, but good morning to all of you who are there in the internet space of the world, where we have all moved to. This is obviously a very, very different by-election than we've had, off-year election than we've had probably in anybody's memory. I think it's the most significant off-year election that we have had in anyone's living memory. And I think it's due to the nature of the issues that are floating around. The two major issues, I believe, especially the one that is totally different for an election, is the Republican denier, Trump-endorsed candidates running for office. That's clearly solely this election's happening. And I think I'll try and talk to it as much as I can. I believe it is critical to understanding what this means for the next elections. And then with that, we have issues, and most off-year elections have issues like the economy, inflation, a particular candidate's problems or situation. We have, of course, the Supreme Court Stoddard v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision. And that set into place a dimension of major proportions in a non-financial issue. In particular, what we saw after that issue occur was a significant increase in women's voter registration, a significant increase in women perceiving the issue as critically important. And to kind of get this issue off the table very quickly, what I'll point to you is that women make up usually have a 63% voter turnout compared to men who have a 59% voter turnout. And women are a majority of the electorate, 52% of the electorate. In addition, women, ever since 1972, have consistently been much more democratic in voting than the men, and men almost always vote Republican, with the exception being the Clinton election of 1976. So the issue of what will the turnout be, and will the women stick with the dot issue as a primary importance, discounting almost everything else, is really one of the underlying connections for this election. Let me go to the second issue here, and it's the one I'm going to pay the most attention to. And that issue is the Republican election deniers, their impact on the election, and Trump's impact on the election. To start with, of the 10 candidates who voted against President Trump in the impeachment proceedings of the U.S. House of Representatives, only 2 are left running in the 2022 general elections. On the other hand, Trump-backed candidates have been phenomenally successful in the primary season. Let me give you some of the most critical cases. In the U.S. Senate, Trump thoroughly endorsed 8 Republican candidates running in the primaries, 7 of whom won. In the U.S. House, Trump endorsed 21 candidates, of whom 17 won. In statewide offices, Trump endorsed 23 candidates, of whom 18 won. So Trump was very, very successful in the primaries of the Republican Party in terms of getting his people past the primary elections. The fascinating thing is that Trump has also been remarkably successful and continues to be successful in having not only his committed Republicans, but most Republicans believing that the presidential election of 2022 was tainted and in some way Biden is illegitimate. When November 10th public opinion survey was taken in 2020, 77% of Trump voters believed that fraud was common in the past week's election. 65%, 2/3 almost, believed that Trump had won the election. False beliefs about voter fraud in the wake of the 2020 election continue to be prevalent. About 30% of the total general public shared the belief that fraud was common in the 2020 elections. And this is mostly based in Republican voters. The durability of the Trump voter and overall GOP belief in the myth of widespread voter fraud in the 2020 elections is solid. And one of these consequences is a belief in Biden being an illegitimate president. In a comparative review of 3 separate national polls taken during December of 2021 that asked whether Biden was legitimately elected, only 20 to 25% of the Republicans in these 3 polls believed that Biden was legitimately elected president. By comparison, between 58 and 68% of all respondents who were Republicans believed that Biden was legitimately elected. Agreement varied between 91 and 97% among Democrats that Biden was legitimate. The level of agreement and the degree of independence was from 55 to 64%. In other words, you have 2 disjoint groups. Republicans, of between 2/3 and 70% of whom still maintain fraud occurred in the 2020 election and Biden is illegitimately president. And then there's Democrats and independents, with Democrats having more than 90% believing in his legitimacy and 55 to 64% of the independents. Fully 72% of those who believe that voter fraud occurred say it was most extensive in the cities of the United States. Mail-in ballots are seen by 77% of the widespread fraud reporters as a source of fraud. Only 22% believe that in-person voting is a source of fraud. Former President Trump continues to publicly decry the fraudulent 2020 elections. He told the August 2022 National Conservative Political Conference, or CPAC, quote, "America's comeback begins this November in 2022. This is the basis of his endorsements of the primary elections. This is the basis that he's selling for what will happen in 2024. So it's very clear that for Republicans, the majority believe Trump should be president. The majority believe the election is fraudulent. So now the question becomes, how many? How many Republicans out there? Well, of 569 Republican nominees for the House and Senate and key statewide offices this year, 291, or 51%, question the legitimacy of the last election and deny it being an acceptable election for President of the United States. That is really what we have as the major concern in voting this year. And in essence, what I would say to you is a number of these deniers may be in Republican-dominated states and regions, but 48 of them are located in competitive states. And the big question for me in this election is how many of those 48 get elected? Because if those 48 can get past the finish line, if, say, greater than half, I'm not sure, 2/3, that sends a signal, a very critical signal to Trump and the Republican Party leaders such as McCarthy. It says to them, we have a good chance of winning the 2024 elections on the basis of contesting that Trump should have been the president and now should be the president of the United States of America. When you hear about elections this year, what you often hear in the papers is pay attention to the states, for example, of Pennsylvania, where Oz is a Trump backer, for example, running against Fetterman, the Democrat. Wisconsin, where Johnson is a Trump backer. Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, where you have J.D. Vance, a Trump backer. Georgia, where you have Warnock and Walker. Nevada, neutral. Arizona, the slate is Trump backers. For U.S. Senate, for governorship, all the Republican congressional candidates, save one, are all Trump backers. New Hampshire has a Trump backer running for Senate. What I would argue is that in these swing states, state like Nevada, while that may help the Republicans flip the Senate, or Colorado, not nearly as critical to what things will mean in this country as does a state, for example, like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Georgia. In other words, I think the focus of the media saying, look at the competitive states, while it's very important, clearly has to be modified by saying, look at the candidates who claim that the elections are false in 2020, and we're going to put the right president back in office in 2024 on that basis. So I went through a Washington Post survey of candidates that specifically asked them whether or not they will accept the results of the 2022 election, whatever the outcome. And here's what you find. In the Senate, Blake Masters of Arizona, Marco Rubio of Florida, Don Bolduc of New Hampshire, Ted Budd in North Carolina, and Ron Johnson in Wisconsin said no or would not give a response that clearly indicated acceptance. By the way, of course, they're all Republicans. For governor, Kari Lake in Arizona, DeSantis in Florida wouldn't open clearly. Derek Schmidt in Kansas, Tudor Dixon in Michigan, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, Greg Abbott in Texas, and Tim Michels in Wisconsin. So again, you have Wisconsin as a possible swing state, though clearly now it leans Republican. You have Mastriano in Pennsylvania, a swing state. You have Tudor Dixon, who likely will be defeated by Whitmer, her opponent. You have Derek Schmidt in Kansas, a red state, but a red state that had, for the first time in history, more Democrats than Republicans registered in the wake of the Dodd decision, a huge increase in voter registration. You have Ron DeSantis in Florida and Kari Lake in Arizona, as I've said. So what you have going here in 2022 is in swing states, candidates who, if elected, will deny the legitimacy of the President of the United States having the right to hold that office. By the way, when they asked in who got a yes, there were actually a couple of senators who are Republicans who said yes, they accept it. And to your surprise, maybe Herschel Walker was one of them. As bad as he may be in his lies and everything else, he accepted the 20 election. Joe O'Dea, running for the Senate in Colorado, accepts that. And Cortez Master in Nevada accepts that. So this is important. For those three Republicans, they are not part of any Trump back swing that says the election is illegitimate in 2020. And if they are elected, it would not affect likely the Republicans' profile on that issue. So we have three Republicans running for the Senate in Colorado, Georgia, and Nevada, who are different in significant ways than the other Republicans. I think this makes for a very, very different election, as I've said before. And there was a poll that came out yesterday, put out by the New York Times. What was interesting about that poll was it was a reversal of everything that had been occurring with regard to women and the vote up to this point in time during 22 election season. What that poll had was that among men, the vote would be 50-45 Republican, but among women, it would be 47-47. Now that is an absolutely incredible shift. I guess what we'd have to do, and the reason I mention this particular poll is the Times is far and away the most nationally centered newspaper of this country and the most widely accepted national newspaper. That poll showed the following, that among people in the United States in July, 36% said the economy was the most important issue. And now in October, 44%. In July, it showed the Democrats up by 3%. Now the Republicans up by 10%. So you have two dynamics going. Three, actually. One is, what happened to the women vote? Or is the New York Times poll simply wrong? They got it wrong in this poll. We can't answer that right now. What I would say to you is watch the exit poll, and even then, watch the material that comes out later. Because if the economy has become of such great concern, mainly dealing with inflation, that the women have shifted their historic position in support of the Democrats, that will change America for the election of 2024. So to kind of sum up, because I thought I would talk for about a half hour and then open it to questions, because I think people's questions become very, 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 very important. And before I do that, I'll do one more thing, focusing on the issues that I've been focusing, which is election deniers. I took a look at where are election deniers running for the position of Secretary of State, in which they could actually have an impact on either vote counting, and by that I mean the following. Secretaries of State can create an audit of elections beyond the mandated audits. They can say the election outcome is unknown because the audits do not produce a clear result, in which case it would go into the legislatures of those states. And the states happen to have a majority of Republican legislatures. So if you want to see the contours of just how off the skids of normality the election of 2024 can go, let me give you some notions of where some of these are. Wyoming, a Republican state. I'll give you all of them in a moment. Arizona, Republican-dominated legislature. Indiana, Republican-dominated legislature right now. Other states include New Mexico, Nevada, Minnesota, Michigan, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. So what the Republicans have going now is they have going for Secretary of State, including in Arizona, where I live, candidates running for an office that's normally not even perceived in the light of the election. It just simply is there and people vote. Straight party. This year, several of those secretaries of state can make a significant difference in how votes are going to be counted for 2024. Well, I'm going to leave that as it is. And to summarize, the big questions coming out of the election of 22 or going into the election of 22 and then seeing what happens. The big question, one, the election deniers. How successful of those 48 that I told you about? What's the proportion that are successful? finding that's going to be a trick, and I'm hoping I can grab it. Second, the women's vote. How important was the overthrowing of Roe v. Wade in the Dodd decision? Initially, we thought it would be hugely important. And the post Dodd decision primaries saw a tremendous increase in the net shift of Democratic votes towards the Democrats in comparison to the pre-Dodd decision primaries. Registration saw net shift of women going up very high. But maybe the economy and inflation have created a change that was not forecasted. So I leave you with those open questions because the election of 22 is wide open for what it will mean. And most significantly, I think, will be the meaning for the 2024 election. Should the deniers win a solid majority of the seats of which they are contesting, especially in competitive states, it is almost guaranteed, that Donald Trump will seek re-election and that the Republican House will immediately begin hearings and beating the drum to marginalize Biden and the Democrats over what have you done wrong these past couple of years. In addition to that, it will be about signaling the election of the United States in 24 will be about the legitimacy of elections. Can the United States guarantee its citizens that their votes are being counted legitimately? That is such a fundamental question in our democracy. And it is the question that is being undermined by the election deniers. And we'll see that other issues may take the fact that even though they, on that issue of election denial, have a majority support among the public, that other issues came into the fore and pushed their election denialism into the background so that they could get elected. I leave you with that, and I'll now open it to questions. And Dan, are you going to be moderator?
Correct. So yeah, if you would like to go ahead and raise your hand, I will call on you and give you your turn to ask questions, Dr. Stern. Looks like Harvey's got his hand up. So Harvey, let's start with you. Go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Mark, will you give your forecast on how do you think the election is going to turn out, both in the House and the Senate?
I'm not a forecaster. I will say this, however. The data seems to have indicated, but this latest Times poll absolutely turns everything topsy-turvy. But even within that topsy-turvy, let me say the following. The forecast initially, given the history of House elections in off-year contests, initially they were forecasting a pretty large Republican majority in the House. That went down and remains at about 10 to 15 seats. Majority in the House will be Republican. Now, this new Times poll that says how significant the economy has become because of the visibility of the inflation with food and gas and housing, I think it may throw a lot into question. As for the Senate, I still think races in places, I like that, races in places like Georgia and Michigan and Arizona are so uniquely visible that the Democrats may well hold on to either 50-50 or something like 52-48 in the Senate. So you gotten a forecast. Write that down somewhere, Harvey, and we could put it into the ballot box of forecasts. And I'm even going to write it down here. I said 50-50 to 52 to 48 Senate and 10 to 15 House Republican. So I wrote it down, and that's just guesswork now, especially in light of this New York Times poll. It is such a significantly different poll. And I think everything has now gotten a big question mark next to it, unless it is simply an incorrect result for them.
Thank you,
More
Harvey.
questions?
We have a queue now. So first Stanford is going to be up, then Sheldon, and then it looks like Maryland.
I can't hear anything there.
Okay, there we go. I'm wondering, do you think the January 6th committee investigation has any influence on this election?
You know, there have been a couple of surveys that I've seen. Here's what they say. Among Republicans, very little impact. Among independents, and I'll talk to this more extensively. You know, I'm an academic, I got to talk. Among independents, there seems to have been some shift away from the Republicans. Among Democrats, it's reinforced. So let me tell you what this means. At this point in time, the independents are about a third of the electorate, and generally independents have lower voter turnout and lower information levels than partisans. However, when we look at the history of independent voting, it turns out, with a couple of exceptions, ever since 1960, the independents consistently become part of the margin of the majority candidate victory. And in this election, given that the independents, somewhere up to 2/3 of them, buy the legitimacy of the election, that means they're leaning Democratic. Again, I think this New York Times poll just has put a big, huge question mark on anything that I've said, except for my pointing out who are the deniers and what's happening with them. That answer your question?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Sheldon, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Irrespective of the outcome of the midterm election in 2022, if criminal charges are brought against Trump for any one of many possible offenses, how do you see that affecting 2024? The commitment of independence, and is it possible DeSantis can win over the Trump base?
No, if Trump is in there, I think he has such a grip on the Republican base, he will be the nominee. That's just my belief about this when I see numbers. And as you can tell, I'm a numbers-based political scientist. I'm what they call a behavioralist. Second, why don't you focus your question a little more? Put the specific question you want to ask.
Well, I'm looking at the possible impact, let's say the impact after 2022 of criminal charges, should they be brought against Trump.
Yeah.
What
You're
happens to that base?
Yeah, you're opening up a very significant area of concern. I hear more and more questions about civil war. And I can't predict such things. You know, one of the things the hearings revealed, the January 6th hearings, that I tend to be an optimist. And what they revealed was that the riot at the Capitol wasn't an isolate of individuals. It was, in fact, an organized riot that was coordinated and planned. Now, that surprised me. I'm sorry for my naivete, but it certainly surprised me. I guess I don't have enough input from the right-wing militia groups. Second, I think the question of what happens if Trump gets indicted in criminal charges is wide open, wide open. Will he get indicted? Trump is the example par excellence of the bias of the United States justice system, in that he spends money with a flourish when it comes to cases with which he is charged in civil suits in the past and now with criminal suits, spends it to slow, obfuscate, or come to some negotiated solution that no one could envision in the beginning, and it takes years. So will the criminal justice system bring him into court with an indictment prior to the 2024 election? I don't know. I hear people talk about, the Justice Department is going to get into court. In New York State, it's a civil suit. And the New York City prosecuting attorney so far hasn't followed up. Georgia is a criminal case. Let's see where all this goes. I just think Trump has been a master. This lead attorney he now has, he paid him $3 million up front to take the case. And he took it. So we're looking at a very unique individual who yet represents what I think is the sum of what is wrong with the American justice system. It is clearly biased to those who have resources. And he is the example par excellence. Sorry, I couldn't answer your question better.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stern. Marilyn, I think you're up next.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's a lot of lawyers that will not work for Trump. So my question to you, I was going to some of these other topics, but they're said already, is do you think that Biden can't seem to get above 40%? Do you think that he has hurt the Democratic Party? Number one. Number two, do you think he will run again? And if he doesn't, for president, that is, do you see anyone else on the horizon in the Democratic Party? I don't. Maybe Joe Manchin, but other than I don't see anyone. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Okay, let me go to these generalized questions. I think that Joe Biden's ratings, which are now in the low 40s, clearly have brought down some of the general popularity of the Democrats. Will he run in 24? I don't read minds. That's the first question that's the first way I always respond to questions like this. I do not read minds. So there are people who are very committed and never give up on running for president and staying president no matter what. There are other people who become much more realistic about this whole issue and step down rather voluntarily. And in Biden's case, I'm going to get off being an empiricist and take my own position. So those of you who want to close your ears and say this is just an individual's claptrap, you can, because it's true. I believe Joe Biden, sorry people, and I'm generally probably of your age, Joe Biden comes across as an elderly man. He walks that way. He sometimes talks that way. And the latest episode where he kept calling for this congresswoman who had been an initiator of a bill but had died more than a year in the past and who he knew had died. That's an example of clear memory issues of the elderly. I'm one of those people who believe that after the election, now that we're in it, Biden should step down for 24 and hand it over to others to take the lead in the Democratic Party. Now, I answered that question from a personal point of view. Let me go to some other answers that you would like to have, and I will pose it, I will give it to you, and I won't even use me as the source.
Thank you.
But the first part of this, I will use me as the source. People forget how open the Democratic and Republican primary systems have become. So that you got a Jimmy Carter, you got a Bill Clinton, you got a Trump, all coming from almost invisibility in the party, and yet gaining the nomination through the primary election systems. So we have to keep that in mind. There are people out there who may very well come almost out of nowhere and catch our attention. Now, it just so happens that I kept a list from Aaron Blake of the Washington Post, who said, here's the names of 10 people who could potentially become the Democratic nominee in 24. So I won't even have to have my list to give to you. Elizabeth Warren, should the progressive side become much stronger than it is with Bernie Sanders. Alexander Ocasio-Cortez. That's the liberals. Now we can go to some non-liberal liberals. Amy Klobuchar, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer up in Michigan, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg. Those are the 9, and he puts Biden as 1. If Biden is not in there, I think that's a pretty good beginning list. And notice how I said that, a pretty good beginning list, because that's how I view it. I think very, very much that the Democratic Party nomination will be an absolute open run should Biden step down. That answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Sanford, I think you got your hand up.
Okay, thanks again. Well, I agree with Marilyn here. I think Joe Manchin would be on kind of the top of the list here as far as replacing Biden, but also who's the California governor? I think he's a possibility. And I'll tell you one fellow that I like. All of a sudden, I like this J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, and see what kind of support he would get for president. Thank you.
I think everyone can pull names out. I'll give you a personal situation that happened with me. I was invited. I had been at the university in Florida and was invited to give a talk at ASU. So I went to ASU, and when I got here, I heard that a guy named Obama was going to give a talk, and he was running for the presidency. This was very early in the campaign of 08. Yeah. And so I went to hear him, because being me, I have to always go when I see this kind of thing happening. I walked away, called my wife, and said, this guy's going to be the Democratic nominee. And he was nowhere rated at the top of the polls. But he was such an effective speaker. And you could see the energy he created. And that was my guess in 08, before the primary season really got going. So I say this to go back to my generalization. In the haystack are the needles. And the needles will be picked up and picked out and gain prominence during the primary election season of 24. That's my saying on this. Other
And
question?
one other comment, if Biden were to run again as president, I kind of feel, you think he's going to keep Harris on as his vice president, or would he change, like Roosevelt always changed his vice presidents? You think he would change vice presidents?
I don't read minds, and I don't know. And I think if he changed vice presidents, he's a sure loser in 24.
Okay, thank you.
That black base in the Republican Party turns out and votes 90% Republican. They make up 17% of the Biden voters in 20. And there goes half of them. So if he wants to lose automatically, he'll pull her off the ticket.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, if anyone else has questions, raise hands. I got one real quick, Dr. Stern. You were talking about kind of just like pure faith in the voting process, how like Republicans, like view the election as legitimate. Looking at history, how do you see that like faith in the institution is being repaired and like our voting process and things like that? Can it be done with one party questioning it?
I can't begin to tell you, but the closest I could come would be the following analogy. Look at the election of 64 and how badly Goldwater got battered because he was painted as an extremist. Now, the Goldwater faction within the Republican Party eventually in 1980 produced a Ronald Reagan. But I cannot tell you what it would take to reestablish the legitimacy of the voting system in the eyes of the 70% of the Republicans who don't see it that way.
Steve Loeb had his hand up.
Pardon me?
Say
Go
that
ahead.
again, Harvey. I couldn't hear who that was.
Unmute yourself, Steve.
Sorry about that. Mark, I'm mostly concerned right now about the Senate campaign. I think that's the most critical of all the elections that we're facing right now. And I'm generally an optimist, so the New York Times article bothers me a lot, but the trend may very well be there on a general basis. But I think looking at it state by state offers maybe some encouragement, and that maybe because we have some stronger Democratic candidates than we do Republicans in certain states, the Democrats could hold on to the 50-50 or better. And when you see what's happening in Pennsylvania with the governor race, where the Democrat Shapiro has come on strong, we see Ryan doing much better in Ohio than he was a traditional Republican state. And even a guy like, I just read that Lee in Utah feels he could be in trouble and reaching out to Romney to help. And Lee is a very strong denier, of course.
Yes.
I get some kind of encouragement that maybe the Democrats could hold on to the Senate.
Yeah,
And
I
maybe
think,
the Times article is, the Times poll is just too generalized and an overview, but not taking into consideration the individual races.
well, I earlier in this talk, I was asked about my prediction, and I thought that the Senate could still be 50 to 52 Democrats. So I'm in agreement with you. The visibility of the election is so high, and the difference between the candidates is so strong that, in fact, that may very well be the outcome in the Senate. And if that's so, that will be a godsend for the Democrats, because losing both houses would certainly just keep the constant drumbeat going and stopping Biden from doing anything in the last 2 years of his presidency except through executive decision, which, as we see in the case of Trump, executive decisions get unchanged unilaterally by the next executive. You got to move beyond executive decisions to have a solid basis of maintaining whatever it is you want to put into place policy-wise. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. It's more of a general question, a dark question. Given the fact that the Trumpism has infected the Republican Party, is creeping into independence, and we may see the election, could possibly see the election go the way of total Republican dominance. We've also seen what Trump has done to the third branch, the judiciary, and I wonder if Trump is elected in 24. Will this great experiment that we call democracy be able to survive? All three branches being trumped.
Well, the Republicans felt that way about the New Deal. All three branches being Roosevelted and turned into socialist activity. I think one has to, particular policies can have agreements and disagreements. The underlying legitimacy is the problem. And let me go to the court. I can find a much more sympathetic argument to this court than many liberals would find. I think if you look at the Supreme Court of the United States traditionally, it's a conservative branch of government. Traditionally. It did not become the modern liberal bastion until it became essentially the post-packing court, where FDR tried to pack it, he failed, was going to try again, and one of the votes turned, and it became a New Deal majority, and then stayed substantially that, with Warren solidifying what became the liberal view. It was, in fact, the Democrats, not the Republicans, who voted out a potential nominee who was well qualified to be a Supreme Court justice, Bork, simply on the basis that he was too conservative. That was the Democrats who started that trail. And then the Republicans picked up on it. Let me go to the second trail about the courts. We all understand what McConnell did to the Supreme Court nominees that Biden put forward. What you may forget is it was the Democrats who changed the rule for appellate court nominees that they do not need a 50 plus one will do it to get us a justice onto the federal courts, not the Supreme Court. So I think the next debate that the Democrats are having, oh, let's make it majority vote, that'll come back to bite them too. We do not operate in an island that is surrounded by water and nothing touches it. Every time you touch something of a major nature in politics, other things happen. And so I think the idea of policy differences, that's usual. The idea of the undermining of the legitimacy of the system, that is the unique element that may play out after 24. That's the thing to watch. That answer your question? You give up. Okay.
Jerry, looks like you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Am I okay? Good. I'm not muted. Given the situation, Mark, that a number of secretaries of state and other election officials will be in a position to negate any vote in some states that they don't like and substitute their own preferences. Do you think, and this of course will most likely result in significant lawsuits, throughout the country where this happens. Do you think that the judiciary will then step in to protect the vote in the United States, or will they just simply ignore it and allow the process and the system to fail, on its own?
Well, that's a really nice question. Will the judiciary step in? There's a case coming before the Supreme Court out of North Carolina, which argues a new judicial idea, legislative sovereignty, that the legislatures, if each state have the right to determine how the electoral vote should be counted in that state. Now, this coming year, in this session of the court, they could say, that makes sense to us. So for now on, whenever a state legislature decides to change how they're going to count the votes cast for president, that's their decision and their right to make the decision, given the way the Constitution is written. That could happen. That really could happen. I think we're going into deep, dark waters that we've never had before. And I cannot predict the outcome. What I can say to you is, yes, it may very well be that by the end of this decade, a different basis for governance in the United States will have emerged. That could happen. Boy, that's my pessimism. I'm usually not a pessimist.
Sheldon, I think you got a question. Go
Right.
ahead.
Yes, I'd like to just share a comment with you about fundamental changes in our system. About 10 years ago, I had the opportunity of attending a limited conference with former senators Danforth and Lieberman on the changing political climate environment in the United States. Both of them said, and they were unified in it, on it, that there was a point in time where Democrats and Republicans, although there were some fundamental differences in policy, could sit down with one another and work it out for what was the best interest of the country. And they said it was usually done informally over dinner. Danforth and Lieberman both said we were different parties, but we really liked each other. And we really could talk with one another in terms of finding out what is best for the United States. They both concluded, Republican and Democrat, both concluded that the fundamental change in our system of government took place with Newt Gingrich when he introduced the idea of win at all costs, that the political party is more important than the issue itself. And it seems that trend continues to exacerbate and get more intense.
Okay.
And a comment.
Oh, I buy that 100%. I am a Gingrich detester. What Gingrich did is he stopped the intra-party voting, intra-party socialization.
Right.
Going to each other's houses, having get-togethers was stopped by Gingrich. He wanted total warfare. He got total warfare. The result is a disaster. So I clearly, absolutely clearly buy into that. Yes. Anyone else? Oh, I'm sorry, Dan, this is your leverage, not mine.
Sorry, Marilyn's got a question. I had myself muted.
Okay, Dr. Stein, I just wanted to tell you, it's unbelievable how I agree with everything you say, and you're not being pessimistic, you're being realistic. And what you say is absolutely correct. And how can the January 6th committee, presenting all of the evidence that you can't refute about Trump, I'm not going to go into it, sitting there watching TV, how can that, you tell me, not change the opinion of Trump in people's eyes when you have the word democracy, which could have been taken away and could be taken away again? Tell me that. I don't understand it.
I think that Trump is a very different kind of political leader in this country. He has what Max Weber calls charisma. We haven't had a presidential candidate who's had charisma like this man has. That means his followers invest him with an almost talismanic kind of property. Whatever he says is true. And even if you know he's deliberately lying or distorting, there's a reason that we can understand. Or maybe we can't understand, but it's a reason that we have to buy into. It is very, very difficult to get into a discussion with people who are election deniers and convince them they're wrong. I teach a class on Thursday mornings, adults, many Republicans in there, and I've spent a full year going and reviewing the Republican and Democratic judges, 62 of them, who backed the position that the election was not tainted by fraud. I spent a year laying out the Republican officials who clearly saw the election in their state, like Arizona, as legitimate. So even in Arizona, let me give that as a good case, where they had this election audit conducted by the Republicans, overseen by the Republican right, the Trump believers. And the results said Biden actually got several hundred more votes than were officially counted. And they still believe the election was fraudulent in Arizona. It is almost impossible in some cases to convince people otherwise, because this may be the example of the big lie that will keep holding on until the day Trump says, you know, folks, I lied about this and it was all a big joke on you. And he's not going to do that. You're simply dealing at the fundamental belief systems, and they're not going to change them. That's the best I could respond.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stern. Anybody have any final questions?
Dave Loeb.
No, sorry, was that Harvey? Okay, I think we're all good. Thank you all for coming today. Don't forget, Dr. Stern will be back on November 15th and he's going to break down the results of the election. I also want to let everyone know that the week that was will be back on October 25th, next week on Tuesday. So tune in for that. Dr. Stern, thank you again very much for being with us today. And I hope
thank
everyone
you.
has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Mark.
you.
It was
My
very
pleasure.
good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I know.